She thought I would never walk away. She was wrong. My name is Ethan Walker, and the thing people never tell you about betrayal is how ordinary it looks at first. It doesn't arrive with a trumpet blast or a cartoonish villain's laugh. It slips in quietly, a misplaced laugh, a late-night text, a silence that swells until it becomes loud enough to drown out everything you thought was true. I was 23 when my life unraveled. They say youth helps you bounce back, that time heals, that you learn. But the first weeks after everything fell apart felt like a kind of hollowing, like someone had scooped out the center of me and left the edges raw and trembling. I grew up in a small, weathered house on the outskirts of Seattle. Rain learned my name before anyone else did. My mother, Linda, learned to carry 3 jobs and smile through the fatigue. My father died when I was a baby in a hit and run on a rain-slicked highway, the kind of accident the town murmured about and then tried to forget. The absence of his presence was a quiet constant in our house, a shape that took space at every table and in every photograph. My brother Daniel had memories of him I never did. That, more than anything else, made him untouchable in the way a ghost is untouchable, a presence everyone else deferred to out of habit or nostalgia or sorrow. Daniel was everything I wasn't. He was loud in the best rooms, handsome in a way that made kids look up, athletic, the kind of man other men envied and women watched when he passed. People called him charming. He knew what to say and when to say it. I learned to take up less space. I learned to laugh softly and not ask for the spotlight. I learned to be small in a world that had made room for a different son. We weren't close. Siblings, we were, in the technical sense, and that's all the family required of us as long as we showed up for holidays and smiled for photographs. We moved in different orbits that only occasionally collided with nerve-grating friction. When I left for college, funded by my Uncle Robert because my mother couldn't afford to send me far, I breathed for the first time. There were no small-town expectations there, no whispers comparing me to someone else. I studied architectural design, and the world opened like a set of blueprints laid clean and new before me. For the first time I felt competent. For the first time I could build things, literal space and an internal sturdiness. I met friends who didn't know Daniel's name, and that anonymity was its own kind of blessing. Emily came into my life in the second year, a collage of ordinary and luminous, practical, funny, fierce in quiet ways, the kind of person who made a room feel safer the moment she stepped in. We fell in ways that felt both inevitable and gentle, late-night study sessions that ran into dawn, coffee thumbs and shared sandwiches, the small human intimacies that add weight and gravity to a life. We moved in together after graduation when both of our careers were finding solid footing. I worked at a reputable architecture firm downtown, my days populated by precise drawings and client meetings. She taught at a community arts center 2 neighborhoods over. Our lives fit together like complementary pieces. We were good people for each other, the type of couple the world nodded at approvingly. I loved her with a trust that felt deeper each year. 2 weeks before everything splintered, I asked her to marry me in my Uncle Robert's garden. He had invited us over for his birthday. String lights, garlic bread warming on the table, our family laughing like the world was steady and kind. I had rehearsed the words in my head until they felt practiced, polished, the way you polish a stone until it catches light. She said yes. She cried. The world brightened at the edges. For a moment the future hummed like a tuned string. Daniel left the party early, like he often did, taking shadows with him. I didn't think much of it. He often needed space. I slept at home that night with the soft glow of the streetlight washing the curtains, and for a while the world was as it should be. Then the messages came. I was at work when my phone erupted. A series of screenshots from a number I thought I had blocked years ago. Daniel's messages, photographs, small, searing proof. I stared at my desk until everything blurred. In one image, Emily's jacket lay slumped over the chair in Daniel's kitchen. There was a picture of a scarf I recognized, the one she always left on our couch when she got home late. A third was the most blunt and obscene of them all. A photo that caught the edge of a mattress and someone else's silhouette in morning light. My hands moved on their own. I locked my office door and read and reread, hoping the words would rearrange into something that made sense. They didn't. The screenshots were not malicious fabrications. They were the brittle evidence of choices made in the space where fidelity should have lived. The sense of betrayal was physical. It rose from the core of me like bile. And with it came a clarity I didn't ask for. I knew, then, that this was not a mistake that could be smoothed over with promises or apologies. It was a wound. I went home and everything looked the same. The lamp where she used to read, the coffee stain on the rug I had promised I'd scrub out, the framed photograph of us at graduation, the one where she leans into me like I am the safest shore. I began to pack without thinking, grabbing what bore her name or smell, stuffing it into a cardboard box like I was collecting the evidence of a life that had been a lie. I moved like a man walking through fog, my gut clenched tight enough to choke. When she returned, she begged. There is a certain architecture to apologies. The steady stream from eyes that want to be believed, hands that reach for redemption, the promises offered as if they were currency that could buy back what had been lost. She told me it had been a mistake. She told me Daniel had been there, wounded and drinking, and she had merely been trying to comfort him. She promised it meant nothing. She said my name with a tenderness that had once been truth. But the photos did not align with that story. The photos were the wrong kind of proof for a casual consoling. They suggested a night that had an ending and a beginning both at once. I texted her that we were over. I blocked her. I changed our locks that night and left a box on the stoop with the things that had been hers, some of them trivial, some of them intimate. The next day my phone felt like it belonged to a stranger as family messages poured in, not all sympathetic, some angry. Daniel's number lit up the family chain like a brand. I watched as the house we'd grown up in became a map of who was choosing what side, The uncle who'd been my savior in college texted condolences and promised to stand by me. My mother, who had always walked the precarious line of being fair, said little at first, then came over to talk, not to console, but to ask why I had made the matter public. I had forwarded the screenshots to relatives and then done something childish and final. I turned my phone to silent and tried to sleep. The message had been impulsive. I won't lie about that. It was the closest thing I had to a public announcement, a way to stake my claim and to make the world of our family see what had happened. I had wanted the truth to stand like a wall between me and Daniel. I didn't consider the dominoes it would topple, the anger, the judgment, the way loyalty is a fragile thing in families. For days, the house was a place of waiting and watching. Some family members slid into my DMs like lifelines, others called and then clung to silence. Daniel's behavior turned inward, the kinds of small self-destructs people have when they are trying to be someone else's villain. He called me once, said things that were short and venomous, as if hurt translates into authority. He sent messages that alternated between apologies he could never carry through and bitter jibes. I don't know if he meant to hurt me to feel strong, or to feel real, but he did. My mother visited. Linda sat on the edge of the couch, hands clasped like a prayer, and said words that tasted like betrayal themselves. She told me to be careful with how I had made the situation public. He is fragile, she said. He has been through a lot. She spoke of Daniel's failures, the failed startup that left him ashamed, the years of unstable jobs that shrank his opportunities until he felt like a shadow in his own life. She framed him like a man who had been stripped down by the world and was only reaching for something he couldn't have. She asked me to think of mercy and to be the bigger man and reach out. I did not reach out. I remember the moment she left. Her eyes were wet but not repentant. She told me she loved me and that she could never condone betrayal, but then asked me to consider his condition, to understand the human behind the headlines I had made in family chat. For a moment I felt small and childish and cruel. I also felt resolute in my heartbreak. How could I be asked to be gentle with the person who had made me a punchline in his own story? Would he have been gentle with me? The next weeks were a sequence of sharp edges. Daniel's calls went unanswered. Emily's messages slowed to nothing. I worked long hours because work felt like a place where time runs in straight lines and consequences are not personal, just parameters and deadlines. At night I would wake in the dark and imagine conversations I might have had differently. I did not weep in public. I believe there is a pride in restraint, and I clung to it until that restraint spat me loose and everything I had held together splintered. My uncle, Robert, was the only family member whose loyalty felt unambiguous. He had quietly bankrolled my first years of college and had watched me grow when my mother couldn't look away from the daily grind. Robert called me often. He came over with pie and coffee, sitting across the room like the old man in the habit of steady presence. He listened, then he spoke. You did what you thought you needed to do, he said. You stood for yourself. Blood doesn't excuse betrayal, nor should it. You have to protect your life, Ethan. His words were a small rescue. For the first time in weeks, I felt a pulse of confidence return. I believed then, with the beast's certainty, that cutting ties was not just acceptable, it was necessary. If the family sided with someone who had hurt me, then I didn't want them. I was tired of bending for people who would not bend back. Then, like a story that folds in on itself, the family fractured. Loyal factions formed. My mother, despite her earlier words, began to visit Daniel more often. She carried casseroles and took on the role of caretaker as if guilt were a tangible thing to soothe. There was a certain performative sympathy in the way she hovered, and in the way I cut her off for a while, angry not just with Daniel but with her for what felt like betrayal on top of betrayal. The pain multiplied, as if grief has teeth that never stop chewing. The months after the fallout had a strange rhythm. People wrote essays in my inbox about forgiveness and the weight of small poor choices. Friends took sides, some in solidarity and some in horror at how publicly I had aired private filth. Emily's absence became a dull ache at the center of my days. I threw myself into a project at work designing a community center, a thing built for people to find themselves without the town's whispers. I wanted to make something that would outlast the pettiness of human betrayal. The blueprints gave me solace because they were honest pieces that acknowledged their own limitations and then overcame them. Time is a peculiar thing when you're grieving a life you had thought was yours. The hours are slow and thick, and yet the calendar page turns with an indifferent swiftness. I moved through the motions. A coffee in the morning, a train ride, clients who wanted solutions that had nothing to do with my heart. I did not date. I did not try to fill the emptiness with casual romances or performative rebound. There was no hunger for distraction. I needed the hollow to be just that, a place to measure how far I'd fallen. And then, precisely when I had convinced myself that the worst had been weathered, the world turned a corner. News travels in a family like the ligaments of a body. A small tug at one place can be felt across the whole. Pictures that Daniel had thought private leaked beyond his walls, and his rooms of vulnerability turned into a theater of pity. The pity made people uncomfortable, and discomfort made them look for ways to make the pain better. My mother told me, in a late-night call, that she couldn't stand watching him suffer and that she made the wrong choice by staying away from him. She asked if I could forgive. She asked if we could all try to rebuild. You'd think the act of forgiveness would be less complicated than the wound itself, but forgiveness is not a single action. It's a series of rearrangements, concessions that change the perspective of your life. I had to think of what my life might be without my mother in it. For all her mistakes, she had been the axis of small domestic things, the woman who stitched shirts and read bedtime stories. To cut her out felt like cutting out a part of myself. I tried to be magnanimous. I tried to imagine reconciliation that didn't involve erasing the wrongs. I texted a sentence of peace, not an apology, not absolution, but an attempt to find a path forward without being trampled. My mother responded with a string of gratitude and old photographs sent like a peace offering. Snapshots of summers, of birthdays, of Daniel's third birthday with sticky cake smeared across his cheeks. The images were knife and bomb, both. It is a strange truth that people sometimes begin to show their worst in the ways they try to heal. Daniel was not well, he drank alone, and after our family fallout the pattern deepened into something with teeth. He would show up on our mother's doorstep at odd hours, sleep on the couch, then later go to work with eyes that had not yet closed properly. When I saw him, our conversations were short, serrated edges. Once, he slammed his fist into the bathroom mirror, not with the intent to hurt himself but with the raw desire to punish the reflection of a life that had failed him. He blamed me for the family's fracture even while he did it to himself. He called me things in the dark and then asked forgiveness in the day. People have a resilience to self-deception that amazes and terrifies at once. The thing about betrayal is that it multiplies casualties. It is not contained to the transgressor and the betrayed. It spreads like an ink blot into the lives of everyone related by proximity and affection. The town's gossip became a soundtrack. There were nights when I would stand on my balcony and imagine a life where I had never proposed, or one where Emily never existed and I was spared the particular brand of grief that arrives when someone you trust chooses someone else. The worst of losing someone to another person is not simply the loss, it is the humiliation of being counted as less. And yet, against my own expectations, life began to entwine itself with mundanity again. Bills were paid, work achievements came, I learned to be alone without collapsing. I found new small satisfactions, a bench at the park where the light is perfect in the late afternoon, the taste of coffee brewed to the proper temperature, the way a book can carry you for hours into someone else's skin. A person can heal into a better version of themselves if they have the will, and part of that will is a tacit refusal to be defined by being wronged. Months later, an invitation slid across the table, my uncle's wedding. He had met someone in a quieter season, a woman of different pace who liked his dry humor and his quiet ways. He asked all of us to the celebration, not as a demand but as a hope that the family could knit itself back together. The invitation arrived with many questions attached. Would I be able to sit in the same room as my mother? Could I be present while Daniel sat in the same corner? I told myself yes because you tell yourself things when you need to look forward. On the day of the wedding, the garden smelled of the same jasmine that had perfumed my proposal 2 summers earlier. The same lights hung, slightly older and more precious now. People wore faces that had healed at different rates. My mother was there, and so was Daniel, the latter appearing gaunter than before, as if suffering had carved space in his cheeks. We exchanged greetings with the awkwardness of people who have missed the nuance of one another's suffering. My uncle's bride put her hand on his arm and laughed like a bell, and for a while, watching them, I thought maybe there is room in the world for second chances. Then, as the reception thinned into an early night, something happened that pulled the threads taut. Daniel drank more than he had in months. He had a way of talking that sounded like he was trying to sharpen his tongue on anything he could find. At one point, he stood and made an awkward toast in which he lumped excuses with thefts and asked for everyone's understanding. The room held its breath. My mother reached for his hand as if to tie him down with human tenderness. The sight of that simple contact, his mother and his fingers curling around her knuckles, felt like salt on the reopened wound. I realized, with a small, bitter clarity, that the family I had imagined as a rescue was not mine to mandate. People will always choose where their heart lives, even if that heart is wrong. I left shortly after the toast. Walking away that night was a choice I had rehearsed 1,000 times. I wanted to stand and shout and be the person who delivered final judgment, but that would have been the victor's cruelty, and I did not want to be cruel. Instead, I drove the long way home through rain-slick streets, the way the city had watched me as a boy, and in the hum of engine and wipers I thought of the future I still wanted to build. Years later, the wound will feel less jagged. Time will smooth the raw edges into a faint scar that sometimes twitches when weather changes. I married again, once I was ready, with someone who had not been a ghost in my past. I learned to steward a love that was reciprocal and to name betrayals early when they whispered at the edges. Daniel and I have not reconciled fully. Our contact is perfunctory and sometimes strained. My mother and I speak now, cautiously and with some new boundaries. She told me once that she had been wrong. Whether she truly believed it or not is a private thing between her conscience and the quiet of the house she sleeps in at night. I forgave her because forgiveness is often less about the person forgiven and more about the forgiver deciding to move. If you ask me what I learned, without the sermon, without the neat metaphors, I will tell you that you learn to pick sides in your life. You learn to listen to the voice that says, protect the person who is you, even if that protection requires you to be alone. You learn that family is not a permission slip to be treated with impunity. You learn that the person you thought you relied on most can become the architect of your worst day, and you learn that day will end and another will begin. Every betrayal I have known left me with 2 magnificent costs, the loss itself, and the self-knowledge it forced into me. I discovered, among other ugly and honest things, that I could feel everything and survive it, that I could build new life from the wreckage of a broken promise. That knowledge is not triumphant in an immediate way. It is not melody. It is a slow, low current that pushes some days and only whispers on others. But it is real. So here's what I keep in the private ledger of the heart. The tenderness of Emily's laughter before everything broke, not to romanticize what she did, but to honor that life slice as something which was once true. The steady presence of my Uncle Robert, who taught me that loyalty is not always loud but can be a quiet, steadfast thing, and the rain, that old friend that stood witness to the way I learned to stand on my feet again. Betrayal taught me a savage lesson about human fallibility and also offered, in its fierce and unwanted way, an uncomfortable grace. You can choose to be broken by it, or you can choose to be remade. I chose to be remade. The process took longer than I expected. It cost more than I wanted to pay. But at the end of that price is a life I built back, with a steadier hand and a clearer sight of who I will let stand at my table.